Hello and welcome to Safety is No Accident, building a culture of safety for your manufacturing operations. My name is Jennifer Libby and I'm a district manager with Insperity, and we are thrilled that you joined today. We'd like to remind you that the webinar will be available on demand for replay, and we would really like to encourage you to engage in the presentation today. So take the polls, enter information into the chat, and then at the end, we'll gather back together and talk about some of the inputs from the conversation. In addition to my work with Insperity, I have over 20 years of experience in human resources leadership in the manufacturing arena, including the oversight of safety. So I've seen firsthand what we will hear our subject matter expert, Peter Zaretskiy, talk about. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Peter. Peter is a safety services manager working with the middle market clients throughout Western region, and he consults on issues related to workplace safety, loss control, and injury prevention. Peter is a certified safety professional and has been with Insperity since 2015. He's previously worked in manufacturing and healthcare industries, as well as in higher education and the public sector since 2005. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Peter.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And hello, everyone. We are very excited to have you join us today. As you take a moment to take a look at the agenda, I want to really briefly go over the main goal of this presentation. We want you to become familiarized with the concept of establishing a safety culture and how it can grow from implementing a safety program and making sure that it touches all parts of your day-to-day operations. Now, as you start building your safety program, there could be some growing pains. Let's make sure we minimize them, and let's start with going over how we can avoid it. Now, for many manufacturers and similar industries, safety is very often a very important part of their missions and values. But it is imperative that safety doesn't get disconnected. It needs to be integrated in your day-to-day operations. It needs to be a part of your protocols, of your procedures, of your standard operating manuals, so on and so forth. And by having a safety program that is robust, and I will go into that in a couple of slides, making sure that it touches all members of your company, it will eventually help you grow a very comprehensive safety culture. Very often, companies ask me, how do we measure safety? How do we compare ourselves to all kinds of other industries and companies out there? One of the best metrics to consider is something called TRIR, which stands for Total Recordable Incident Rate. It is a value put forth by the Department of Labor and its subsidiary Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, this is probably going to be the only math that we're going to do today. However, it takes into account the number of what we call recordable incidents. These are injuries that went beyond first aid as necessary treatment. And after multiplying it by a coefficient, we divide by a total number of hours worked. This gives us a value that we can then compare to all the other companies within your industry. And you are welcome to go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and see how you can compare against your competitors. The goal is, of course, to come as close to zero as you can. This means you haven't had any recordable incidents and your workplace is injury-free. And as another boon, you have to keep in mind that the lower your number is, the less attention OSHA pays to you. And I always tell clients, this is always the best place to be, because if OSHA doesn't pay attention to you, that means you're doing everything right and you're not subject to their enforcement. Of course, we have to also consider the challenges. As you start building your safety program, you have to make sure that you also allocate the necessary resources and time And those of you who are members of leadership, you are able to connect with the actual implementers. That is, people who will be putting the safety program to use, making sure that it becomes integrated into policies, into procedures, into practices. And we want to make sure that it is not a lackluster attempt. We want to make sure that it is not a generic policy that somebody just copied off Google, because it is simply not going to do the job that we intend for it. Let's start by looking at some of the common safety solutions and understanding how these risks can be mitigated by implementing a robust workplace safety program. If I was to go into your individual plants and factories right now, there's a really good chance that I would see, if not all of the threats listed below, then the majority of it. And all of these threats, they are controlled in one way or the other. I'm sure you are doing the best you can. You are allocating resources, you are allocating manpower, and you're trying your best to prevent workplace injuries. But as you try to communicate these needs to your leadership, please realize that your leadership is stretched across multiple initiatives, some of them dealing with safety, some of them dealing with pretty much everything else that requires during a business operation. So how do we make sure that we take these hazards and we properly communicate them so that they receive necessary priority and attention? We gain support from a leadership team from having a safety program in place that actually establishes a robust, comprehensive, and cyclical safety assessment process. And I will go into greater detail into as we go forward with this presentation. Similarly, we want to make sure that as we look at individual safety hazards, we compare it with the existing OSHA standards, and we establish what thresholds we need to go under. And if we pass that threshold, we need to make sure that we have appropriate measures and controls in place. And that will help you gain support for answering some of the tough questions. How much resources we need to allocate? What is the priority? What is the urgency? And by combining all of these elements together, you are starting to build what we call a safety infrastructure. And again, there are several components that we will go into greater detail, so stay tuned. Now, I want to very briefly pass the torch back to Jennifer, who will open a small poll for you to review.
Thank you, Peter. Again, audience, please take time to engage in this poll. We're very interested to hear which safety services take your team the most time. Is it understanding who takes responsibility for each safety review or task? Is it training of management and supervisors? Is it self-inspection? Or is it developing policy statements? Take a moment and let us know your thoughts.
Now, let's also take a moment to determine how do we identify hazards before they happen, perhaps the most important portion of building a robust workplace safety program. The primary importance here is really to make a twofold effort. We want to make sure that we implement corrective measures and controls before incidents happen. And we safeguard the employee well-being, and we minimize the amount of injuries as well as their severities. Why? Because that will, in greater scope, reduce our overall liability and reduce the damages that your business will have to endure as a result of an unfortunate incident. Now, as we look over the process of hazard identification, you see some of the benefits listed in front of you. There are at least 7 that we can come up with, but you can also see how they are actually building one on top of the other. A preventative risk mitigation helps you establish a robust system of controls that ensures employee safety and well-being It keeps you in compliance. And what is the result? We improve productivity by reducing the costs that get allocated following an incident. So we are subtracting potential damages and injuries. And to close the loop, we establish a positive safety culture, which, remember, is our ultimate goal with this entire exercise. And whenever I look over individual safety programs, whenever I work with one of my clients, I always want to make sure that the hazard identification process includes one of the 6 elements, more often than not, multiple of these 6 elements as its foundational blocks. You want to be able to collect as much information as possible, both on the proactive side and on the reactive side. So on the reactive side, it could be performing your investigations following an incident. But on the proactive side, we want to conduct inspections. We want to conduct assessments. We want to be able to identify both safety hazards that can create a potential for an immediate injury and health hazards, conditions that can impact the employee's well-being years down the road. So think about some of the hazards that are relevant to your industry that can happen at your individual facilities that can impact somebody's well-being in the long run. And as we identify these hazards, we prioritize them, we characterize them, and we're able to establish almost a matrix of what needs to be addressed first and what requires immediate attention, as opposed to what can be addressed second, and so on and so forth. Now, at this point, I actually want to take a little detour, and I want to mention how I am incredibly proud to be a part of Insperity's safety service team, a group of dedicated safety consultants spread throughout the continental United States. And we work together with our clients, and we assist our clients by explaining to them how to implement a safety program, how to assess their workplace hazards, how to recognize the workplace hazards, how to ensure that they're doing the best they can to have the identification process in place, how to recognize these hazards, implement appropriate controls, and train their employees. Our consultants address this in a variety of ways, including ongoing conversations with our clients, remote assessments. If the situation calls for an on-site visit, it is also something that we are able to accommodate. But it is something that we hold very important and take great pride in making sure that our clients receive appropriate assistance with. So let's make sure we get with the program. We have a safety program in place. What are the elements? What are the foundations? What do we need to pay attention to? Our goal, as I've mentioned before, is to create a culture of safety. That means members of the leadership and the individuals who actually implement the program are on the same page. Everybody understands what the process is and what are the steps and parameters that we need to stick to. As I've mentioned before, our common goal is twofold. We want to reduce the overall trend of injuries, that is, we reduce the frequency, and we lower the severity of the incurred injuries and damages. And here is also something I want to bring your attention to. Some of you have controls already in place, and you will tell me, Peter, we give our employees personal protective equipment, gloves, helmets, safety glasses, what have you. Great. I congratulate you on it, and I will tell you that implementing this particular level of control reduces the frequency of injuries, that is, how many injuries occur. Same with training. We prevent a high number of injuries from occurring. However, they don't really affect the severity, the impact of those injuries. In order to reduce the impact of the injuries, we need to go a step beyond personal protective equipment and training. We also want to make sure that we add perhaps engineering controls, or even substitute one hazardous activity for a less hazardous activity. An example I can give you is taking a look at your process, and let's say we can substitute a less hazardous substance or less hazardous chemical into the process without affecting the productivity. But overall, even if the exposure does occur, we reduce the severity of the damages incurred. Now, there are at least 9 elements that I want you to keep in mind. And as you see them being listed on the slide in front of you, take a brief moment to look through these. I will simply tell you that whenever I look at a successful workplace safety program that builds upon a safety culture, it needs to be a cyclical program. It's cyclical in where you review its efficacy and its efficiency. You're able to repeat the assessment and hazard identification process, and you're able to determine whether or not you were putting in robust controls from the very beginning, or if they need to be adjusted, if new controls need to be introduced, and that all is being coupled with appropriate employee training. And I will spend a little bit of time talking about the necessary elements of employee training in a few minutes. That falls under the curriculum. But overall, once you complete all of those steps, you will have a successful program in place. How do we make sure that we stick to the plan? How do we implement the program and making sure that we are keeping ourselves in check and capturing all the necessary items? I ask you, once you build the program, don't skip any steps. Involve all the people that you identify as necessary. Some of you may already have a dedicated safety professional who's already part of the staff. That's wonderful. Some of you, unfortunately, don't have that manpower to accommodate a dedicated position, and you allocate this function to somebody who performs a different task. It could be one of the production managers. It could be director of facilities. There are multiple people who can take over this responsibility as well. Some of you may even determine to put together a safety committee. Again, we want to make sure that all of these individuals are aware of their responsibilities and they have the necessary tools and resources to actually work together and complete the job put forth in front of them. Make sure everybody understands who conducts the inspections. It could be the safety committee that I just mentioned. It could be the dedicated safety officer or safety manager, whichever title you give that individual. Or you can actually assign individual departments within your facility to conduct their own safety inspections. However, you want to make sure that you give them appropriate tools, be it checklists, be it assessment sheets. You want to make sure they know what they're looking for and that they're trained to look out for hazards that are unique to their operations. If, for example, there is a flammable substance being used in that area, train those individuals to look out for points of ignition that can cause a runaway situation where there's an explosion, there's a fire, there's a personal injury, so on and so forth. We want to make sure that at the very basic level, a safety program builds upon safety awareness. So like I said, we look at day-to-day operations, we take a look at emergency situations. But what we don't want to happen is have our employees be caught off guard, where they're simply looking at the events unfold in front of them and they aren't sure what the appropriate response is. So again, the most important part of our safety identification program is to outline what hazards are unique to this particular area, to this particular department, to this particular workstation. You can be as detailed as you want. And once you identify those hazards, you consider the controls, and then you train your employees to understand what controls are necessary, why are they being put in place, and what hazards they are controlling. Furthermore, we want to make sure that employees understand what their responsibilities are as opposed to what the company's responsibilities are. We want the employees to do their part. And if the employees see that the existing controls are simply not doing good enough of a job, there is a two-way communication in place. Employees are able to communicate to their leadership, this control is simply not working. I feel that I'm being exposed to this hazard without any protection in place. Let's go back, let's review the process, let's make sure that we recognize all the possible things that can go wrong, and we account for them, and we control them to the best of our ability. And overall, a robust and effective safety program will include these 4 items. In no particular order, it will provide necessary information that is relevant to that particular individual hazard. It will consider the education level and maybe even some language barriers that exist, because we want to make sure employees understand exactly what their responsibility is and how we expect them to function with the controls that we put in place. We emphasize that the program only works if everybody does their part, because if the instructions are written but nobody actually follows them and there is no way to check for it, unfortunately, the whole thing falls apart. And this is where the confirmation piece comes in. We want to make sure that there is a very consistent and solid level of understanding. It is in your best interest to have basically a competency check. After you perform the assessment, you put in controls, you train the employee. You can actually bring that employee back into the area, back to their workstation, and ask them, why don't you show me what is the hazard that is relevant to your day-to-day performance? What are the controls that you need to look out for and abide by? And how will you know that something is amiss, that something is actually going out of control and you have an emergency situation on your hands? And how do you know when to report an emergency, how to go about it, and what appropriate response steps you need to take? You want to make sure that the educational materials are also robust, they are comprehensive, and they coincide with the employee's best level of understanding. You want to make sure that you create a checklist of necessary competencies that you want the employee to show after the training is completed. You want to make sure that the delivery is applicable. Do you want to gather people in a class and explain to them what the main concepts are? Or do you want to have more of a toolbox talk where people are given a chance to be shown how to perform a task safely with the controls already in place? And once again, I'm going back to my earlier statement where it needs to be a cyclical process. We want to make sure that we review the information put forth and we test its validity. We want to make sure that we are providing the best kind of information to the employees possible so that we can go back and review the entire safety program. I also want to touch upon the accident investigation programs, an incredibly important piece because it helps us take a look at the overall hazard assessment process and make sure that we find out where the gaps are. Because you can put forth a safety program, you perform your initial hazard assessment, but unfortunately an incident occurs and it results in an injury. You want to have a process in place where you involve employees and you perform a robust investigation in order to determine the root cause. You want to understand what happened. You want as many people participating in analyzing the circumstances of the accident, what led to it, what triggered it, what were the consequences, because that is part of your analysis. And then you determine the best response. Do you put in additional engineering controls? Is more training necessary? Or do we just need to give people better protective gear? I will give you a hint. The answer is the combination of all three. And you want to approach it from all three sides, the engineering controls, the in-person training, and personal protective gear in order to make sure you cover your bases and you go back and you reassess your safety program and you ask yourself, are we doing everything we can to make sure that this incident doesn't repeat itself? Now, I want to turn it back over to Jennifer, who has yet another poll question.
Thank you, Peter. At this point, please remember to engage in this poll and for your own safety program, which areas do you feel that you could use the most help with? Is it developing a plan to improve health and safety? Is it evaluating and updating education and training? Is it rules and procedures? Help with self-inspection or other? So please take a few moments and give us your feedback on this poll.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Now, we talked about different blocks that build a robust safety program. How do we make sure that it actually brings us to a safety culture that starts at its safety compliance and ends with a commitment of leadership to maintain a safe workplace environment? It really behooves you as members of leadership to put together a way to communicate to your employees and ask them, do you feel that the safety environment within our operation, within our company environment is improving, it is growing, and if there are areas of improvement, what are they, and how can we as leadership help you? You want to consider the evaluation of ongoing safety issues. Those can arise from assessments, they can arise from accident investigations, or you ask employees, bring forth your concern, talk to us. Feel free to communicate your fears and your concerns to us. And of course, you look at all that communication, you prioritize which are the quote unquote squeaky wheels, which are the lost trends, and where do we need to apply our attention first and foremost. And this is also where Insperity safety consultants can assist you. We can help you with analyzing these injury trends, and we can tell you, for example, you're putting forth incredible amount of attention to make sure that you're preventing accidents during your hot work or your welding operations. But we are seeing a rise in injuries that result from slip, trip, and falls. Let's shift our attention slightly. Let's make sure that we always prioritize areas where injuries are happening mostly and where they're most common and where they result in highest severity. Because once we prioritize that, we are able to work our way down the list. And once we address one source of injury, we can move on to the next one. And then we help reaffirm who is responsible for making sure that these hazards are being observed and that they're being checked on, either daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. That really depends on the scope of the hazard in of itself, the severity of the injury that it can cause, and the consequences that result afterwards. Because a robust safety program always makes sure that you aren't prioritizing quote unquote wrong items or items that simply aren't worth as much time and attention. It's not worth waiting for a huge catastrophe to happen while you have all kinds of small injuries happen that can in fact accumulate and negatively affect your statistics in general. So let's make sure that we have a good introspective on your entire safety process and make sure that we duly address all the areas of concern. As we invest into all these areas of concern and we have a proactive and effective self-assessment and corrective process, it will be a due investment into long-term success. To recap, I want to make sure that you have a program that is comprehensive and it is responsive to your individual hazards. As you review the hazards that are unique to your operation, go back to your safety program and edit it appropriately. Again, this is where my colleagues and I are able to assist you with. We want to make sure that your safety program talks to your unique hazards and it doesn't address anything extra, nor does it leave out components that are crucial to your individual operations, to your individual needs. We always begin with the hazard identification. We repeat it as many times as necessary. We help you make sure that you have a cyclical process of these inspections because you always want to determine the controls that we have in place. Are they appropriate? Are they in-depth enough? And are they doing their job? Or do we need to implement additional controls and combine that with employee training to make sure that the information, quote unquote, sticks and we are effectively reducing both the number of injuries and their severity in the long run? At this point, both Jennifer and I welcome any questions you may have, and we look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So many insights, so many reminders of what works, that making sure that communication is good, that culture of wanting to come forward when something does happen. And again, not waiting and overlooking all the things that are within our control every day. Please now give us a few minutes. Audience, thank you so much for your participation. We're going to take some time and gather that input, and then we're going to get back together and talk about what you said, and we'll go from there. Peter, I see we have a few questions from our chat. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Great. Yeah, well, the first question in our chat is, how should we stay updated on new safety regulations that impact our industry?
That is an amazing question. So there are actually several sources. Perhaps the best way to go about this is to regularly check the OSHA website itself. That would be osha.gov. They usually have a couple of newsletters that they publish, as well as industry-wide announcements. For example, the most recent one that became pretty relevant, especially for us on the West Coast, but as you know, as the West goes, so the rest of the country does. We started talking a lot about the indoor heat illness prevention. So there were multiple announcements that were being posted, first as the standard was being developed, and then announcements came out when we were told that it's time to begin implementing them for places where indoor heat illness is likely. So that would be the best way to start. There are also various industry trade groups that you can look into. But this is also where you're welcome to ask us, your Insperity resources. And we are also staying on top of these advancements throughout the country. And we always advise our clients, depending what industry they're in, whether or not there is something that's coming down the pipe that they should really pay attention to.
That's super helpful, Peter. And I know from my time in safety, there are some local groups that sometimes are active, but it really depends on kind of the volunteer efforts. And so that really kind of, impacts that outcome. Another question that we had in the chat are, what are some ways to reinforce continuous learning about safety? You said there's a lot of changes going on. So how do we continuously support that?
I would suggest that as you train your employees on performing their job in the first place, make an organic addition of adding the safety aspect towards every single task that they perform. And it doesn't matter what the task is. It could be something as simple as sweeping the floor, keeping a good clean house at the workplace, so to speak. But even those simple tasks can lead to an injury if the employee trips and falls, if they suffer a strain. Just the causes are numerous. So in order for you not to think about, are we training enough on safety? I would rather say, look at all your training regimen, look at all the education that you provide to your employees, and simply add the safety element. So for example, you're training your employee on how to complete a task A. Also add, by the way, this is what can happen. This is what can injure you. These are the hazards that you need to look out for. And let us discuss various ways of protecting you from those hazards, be it utilizing engineering controls, guards, shields, what have you, utilizing your personal protective equipment, and just exercising best practices on not putting yourself in the line of fire. So that, if done cyclically, on a quarterly basis, on monthly basis, even on weekly basis, if you do things like toolbox talks, they will all add up and be very beneficial going forward.
That's a great point, and it speaks to another question from our chat in terms of frequency. The question is, how often should we conduct emergency drills, and how do you ensure that employees are well prepared for the drills?
I absolutely love this question. Emergency preparedness is something very near and dear to me. So If we go back to the standard, if we go back to OSHA, the very bare minimum, mind you, whenever we talk about OSHA standards, they give you the base threshold. They ask for an annual drill. Okay, and a good drill doesn't take a lot of time. If you're practicing emergency evacuation and you need to shut down your plant for 30 minutes, something may be wrong here. Now, obviously, I want to be respectful of the fact that you have a very involved operations, very large amount of moving parts, quite literally. And the way I would recommend it to a manufacturing plant is break it down by departments. So I would say on quarterly basis, especially if that area houses a lot of hazardous substances, where you can have a runaway reaction, where you can have a exposure to the respiratory system, and you can have, like I said, an explosion or a fire. Make sure those teams, those departments are drilled on quarterly basis. Make sure they know exactly where the evacuation route is, where the emergency exit is, make sure it's not obstructed, and basically drill those employees so that in the event of the emergency, they aren't even thinking about it. It's more of a muscle memory. I would say quarterly is the best way to go about it. And then you combine other departments alongside, and at least once a year host a company-wide or facility-wide evacuation drill.
Great points, James. And I love your point about muscle memory. When things get, things happen quickly and they're excitable situations, we tend to forget things that are even basic to us. So the repetition is key. We have another great question in our chat. And it is, I'm working on the SDS sheets. Do you have any information that would help me know I am compliant?
SDS sheets, for those of you who aren't familiar with this acronym, it stands for Safety Data Sheets. Back in the old days, we used to call them the Material Safety Data Sheets. But, so first of all, if you are referring to them as the SDS, is already a good indication that you're on the right path. When you say you're working on the SDS sheet, I want to specify whether you are creating them as a producer of a hazardous material, or you are maintaining the database as a receiver of a hazardous material. That is, your plant has bought some chemical stocks and you are basically keeping track of your SDS sheets as part of your hazard communication compliance. But in either case, what you want to make sure is that when you go to the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, it lists all the necessary categories that have to be present on the SDS sheet that is compliant with the Global Harmonization Standard. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a great piece of legislation that was put forth on the global scale so that no matter where you get your chemical from, no matter what manufacturer, what country, the documentation that accompanies it will always follow the same format. So we always know exactly where to look for things like components or first aid or what to do in case of an emergency release. So to answer the question, as long as you look at the standard and all the categories are listed, are also reflected on your SDS sheet, then you are in compliance.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for the questions in the chat. At this time, we'd like to move forward and talk about the results from the polls that we got. Again, thank you guys all for participating in that, and we'd like to go now to that next slide. So the question was, which safety services take your team the most time? So 37.5% of you said understanding who takes responsibility for each safety review or task. So to your point, Peter, outlining those things. The second, but equally tie, or I should say the tie there, was 37.5% of you said training of management supervisors. So again, that onus on making sure people know what to do and they know when to do it. None of you indicated self-inspection, and then 25% of you said developing those policy statements. So some great comments from Peter in terms of resources, certainly Insperity, OSHA.gov, I know we've had some other suggestions in terms of local areas, but great feedback on that. So thank you for your response to that poll. Let's move forward to the next poll result. The question was, for your own safety program, which areas do you feel you could use the most help with? So a resounding 42.9% of you said rules and procedures. So those safety data sheets, or as Peter said, those material safety data sheets, as those of us who've been in the industry for a while knew them, it's a big component of that. Moving down to the next highest number, evaluating and updating education and training, at 28.6% of the comments with that. And then tied at 14.3% equally were developing a plan to improve health and safety. So again, where do we start? How do we commence on this journey? And then the self-inspection came up at 14.3% on that as well. So great feedback on that as well. More polling information or more polling results. And that may have been the only poll with that. So let's go to the next slide. So thank you all so much for attending this webinar. Thank you for your questions.